Well, to debate this, I'm now joined by the founder and CEO of mentoring organisation Mentivity, Sace Holmes-Lewis, and a lawyer and legal editor of Spiked Online, Luke Gittos. Thank you both very much indeed for joining us. Sace, is this really a workable idea, bearing in mind it's basically an invasion of privacy, isn't it?
Well, you say it's an invasion of privacy, but what's happening to our young people on a daily basis, that they're being exploited, and this has been fueled by the drug game. And I think that we need to focus on this as well. I think Sean Bailey's late to the party, as he always is, and obviously he's trying to do this to make up obviously lost ground in the polls. But I think we need to really focus on this as a holistic issue. If we then stop the demand, then we can stop the supply. And that's what the problem is. And we're criminalising young black boys and young white boys and anyone that's involved in the county lines, but we're not going to the source of people actually buying the drugs. And we need to do that. And actually, the Met Police have to do more. And rather than focus on stop and search in certain areas, why not go to Kensington? Why not go to more affluent areas and private schools? Because this is where this cocaine has been purchased.
Luke, what do you make of that? Basically, it could tackle crime related to drug selling. And of course, one big consideration for Sace and the work he does, it stops young people getting stabbed.
Well, I certainly would applaud the work that Stace is doing, but I think to focus on middle-class drug taking, I'm afraid, is missing the point. County line drug dealing involves mostly the sale of crack cocaine, which is a completely different target market to middle-class cocaine users. I agree that there is a problem with middle-class cocaine use, and those using cocaine have to recognise that they're playing into an appalling industry that internationally causes many, many thousands of deaths every year. But I think the problem in London and in our inner cities is more complicated than simply focusing on middle-class drug use. I think the importance of the work that Stace is doing is to provide frameworks through which young men can find meaning in their lives, which is bigger than useless, nihilistic and appalling violence that we've seen. You know, we need to give these young people opportunities and role models, most importantly, people who can provide them with a narrative to their life, which does not then require them to become involved in, serious youth violence. I think that these tests to raise this. I'm afraid the problem with the Tory government is that when they don't have a problem for something, they will tend to resort to authoritarianism as the response, and that's what we're seeing with Sean Bailey. The idea is that if you introduce some insanely authoritarian measure where you completely blur the line between your working life and your personal life and effectively force employees to disclose the fact that they've taken drugs, this is not a solution. This authoritarian solution will not deal with the levels of youth violence that we're seeing.
But Luke, in some ways people might not quite see there's a disconnect here, because basically there is a problem, isn't there, that the middle class, the wealthy, can afford these drugs and they are actually fueling the demand.
Definitely. And I agree with you. I fully agree with you, Bill. Sorry, just to interject. I fully agree with you. And I agree with some of the things that you said, Luke, because in terms of obviously role modeling, this is why Mentivity was set up. It's to provide mentoring support, informal education through conversation-based learning, and also progressive pathways into employment. We just launched a massive program with Goldman Sachs. So we're trying to do that in terms of trying to navigate young people away from that. But what you've got to understand is some young people don't have the choice. When you're going to food banks, both your parents are working 40-hour weeks and you're at home being raised by YouTube and social media, and you don't have what you need in life, you're going to go to the streets. So again, yes, it is a socio-economic problem. But again, we look at middle-class drug use as something that, it's a slap on the wrist. But when we stop a young person with cannabis, they're criminalized almost instantly. So as a lawyer, you've got to look at it from that perspective, that we need to look at this now as a structural issue.
Luke.
Well, I agree, but I think there's a few issues there, and I agree with you with regards to the criminalisation of young people involved in cannabis. I think the justice system has a lot to answer for in the way it criminalises young men, and I think that there is a whole conversation to be had around decriminalising large swathes of the drugs trade, because I think that decriminalising possession and the use of drugs will hopefully have the impact of regulating and introducing greater controls into the way that these drugs are supplied. And I think that would be of real benefit. So I agree with all those points about decriminalisation. I think the problem with Sean Bailey's proposal is that really it ignores the really complex social factors which set the terms for this violence. And I agree that poverty plays a part. But I also think we have to recognise that this problem of serious youth violence is quite a specific one, and it's one which is driven by very specific and complicated motives. You know, not all young people who are involved in poverty, very serious levels of poverty, turn to serious youth violence. We have to look at what is going on specifically with these killings, which, by the way, are not all driven by drugs. You know, there are large numbers of these knife crime murders happening in our inner cities every year that have nothing to do with drugs, have nothing to do with county lines whatsoever. You know, a lot of them involve low-level disagreements that spiral out of control in a very destructive way. And I think in order to try and get a handle on this, we have to be really specific about what has happened over the last few years. And when we do that, we do see that actually knife crime is getting better. You know, when I was growing up in the 1990s, knife crime in London was actually a more serious problem than it is now, which is interesting because it sort of underplays, you know, it challenges the idea that this is a problem of austerity, because knife crime was a much bigger problem under New Labour than it is now. So, but I think the work that has to be done is actually looking at our young inner city young people in the eyes and saying, look, we need to treat them like they're our fellow citizens. And often we don't. Often we speak about young black men as though they're some alien creature who we don't grow up around, who we don't interact with on a daily basis.
Let's say, I'm sure there's a lot you want to respond to then, and I'm going to give you the chance to do that right now, but I do want to get back to focus on Sean Bailey's proposal, which I want to concentrate on that a little bit more. But I know that you've got, I'm sure, a few things to say about what Luke's just said.
Yeah, I mean, Luke, I agree with you, and I do agree with you on so many different things, but it does come down to the reasons why young people are becoming involved in these situations. It goes back to the austerity, the cuts in education, also, obviously, young people, higher rates of exclusion, but then also a lack of opportunity. And I agree with you, and that's why Mentivity and organisations like United Border, Amani Simpson, Aviard Inspires are doing the local work, and we're not able to get the funding to do the work. However, going back to Sean Bailey, again, he's come up with an idea and he's not giving it much thought. And he's obviously put something out there which is interesting and can have a part to play.
Are you being a bit cynical? He's just chasing votes here, because the actual idea is really basically going to punish employers for something they are simply not responsible for. And to have some sort of league table, obviously the information will be anonymous about individuals, but have a league table concerning companies in London with drug use amongst their ranks?
Like Luke says, obviously the Tory government, very authoritarian approach, and that's what the issue is that they're looking at the root cause of the problem. And Sean Bailey doesn't really have a clue. He's a very disconnected black man, and I will say that because he comes up with a lot of things that he says in the community that he has no clue of. So this is another situation where he's put his hat into the ring and he doesn't even know what he's talking about. However, we have to look at it from different angles, and we have got to look at it from the preventative, look at it from the mid-range in terms of the spectrum and the far end of the spectrum. And once we do that, we can start to solve this problem.
Luke, Sace mentioned earlier about reducing the police workload here on this. Obviously, there's a huge demand on the police at the moment. Any positivity about Sean Bailey's initiative here concerning that?
Not really. I think that the police in London face a real crisis in that they are asked to over-police not very serious conduct, i.e. stopping and searching anyone whose car smells like cannabis, while also failing to police very serious conduct. You know, you saw one of the points made in the Lammy review a few years ago was that a lot of these criminal gangs that recruit young people into their networks are not being adequately policed. They're not being adequately intervened against. So the police in London, I think, suffer from both having to over-police minor conduct and let go more serious conduct. And I don't think Sean Bailey's...
Could that not, though, target the demand from middle-class cocaine use, though? Could that not be a way of trying to cut that demand off?
But as I say, the idea that people who take drugs at companies like Goldman Sachs, or not making any specific allegations there, let's just say general...
Very careful.
But middle-class drug users, the idea that these people are buying from... directly from the working class youth who then go out and commit knife violence, I think is wrong-headed. The drug supply networks are more complicated than that. Unfortunately, a lot of the time, poorer young men are providing drugs to other poor young to other poor people. The middle class trade actually functions.
Not on the skills.
Okay, just a final response to that from Sace, because we are running out of time. Sace.
not on the magnitude that we're talking about. Like, this is low level and they're being exploited. Yes, they have a part to play in it, but again, if they don't have the system in place, then they don't get exploitation. They don't have the opportunity to sell drugs. And again, we're not looking at this holistically. We're not looking at this in terms of early intervention and the number of issues that young people are facing, and obviously adults obviously facing, because they're taking drugs and they're actually fueling this, and there's blood on your hands, and employers turning around and saying, well, look, it's not going to benefit us. But what about young people that are losing their lives every day? What about young families that are being destroyed by drug use?
Right.
We've got to think about that holistically.
I'd love to talk more on this. Sadly, we're out of time. Sace Holmes-Lewis and Luke Gittos, thank you for a really interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.